Welcome, everyone. We are still in Exodus, but we're actually in a new series because we're in a different part of Exodus. So if you were with us, this has been a long story. We've been in this story since January. We started in January with Genesis, and we worked through what's the genre of the story, what's the problem God is trying to solve, who are the characters, what's the plot, and we worked all the way through Genesis, and then we got into Exodus, which was the story of God rescuing his people from slavery in Egypt. And so we went through the first part of Exodus, which is the part of the story everyone knows about, right? It's the showdown between God and the bad guys get defeated. And we love that part of the story because who doesn't love seeing bad guys get defeated? And now we're in the second part of Exodus. We're in a new part of the book. And so it's I've got a new title to the sermon series because instead of rescuing his people from Egypt, that's already been done, now God is teaching his people how to be a people. And so this sermon series is entitled Lessons in Freedom. What does it mean to be actually free? What does it mean to be a free follower of God, a member of the family of God? And Christians see a paradigm here. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? Because from the very beginning of Christianity, Christians have read Exodus and seen a parallel to what God did in Jesus. And so the paradigm of God rescuing his people from the clutches of slavery in Egypt, Christians saw that as through Jesus, God rescued all of us from the forces of sin and death. And the new Egypt was the forces of sin and death. The new Pharaoh was the evil one, and this Passover lamb was Jesus, through whose sacrifice God was able to rescue all of his creation from that slavery. And the image of the Red Sea was the image of baptism. So passing through baptism, all of Pharaoh's armies were drowned, and that which had enslaved creation no longer held power or force over their lives. And then the rest of the story starts. So what does it look like to be free? What does it look like to be free? Christians would also say, what does it look like to be spiritually mature? That's the sermon series we're in right now. Last week, we started with the first lesson that God taught his people, the lesson of manna, the lesson of enough. That sermon is on the website. It's also got the full service that's posted on the website, also has the presentation where we honored Kelly and celebrated the day school. And so if you want to go look that up, that's on our YouTube channel. And it was a beautiful moment with all the day school kids there. That was the first lesson of the series. The second lesson that God teaches his people is what I'm calling the lesson of covenant. And there are two themes that go very, very closely together, covenant and law. And this is actually the bulk of the third section of the book, covenant and law. Next week, I'm talking about law. This week, I'm talking about covenant. But in essence, what happens in the timeline of the story is after God brings his people out of slavery in Egypt, he leads them through the wilderness, and that's where he teaches them the manna lesson, so he gives them bread in the morning. And then he brings them to a Mount Sinai. And at that mountain, he gives them the law and makes a covenant with them. Now, we're going to talk about law next week because that's a very important other half of this coin. But what I want to talk about this week is this word covenant. Covenant. We've seen this word before in our story, remember? God made a covenant with Abraham, said, I will bless you, and through you the nations of the world will be blessed. And so God called Abraham out of his father's home and led him to a new place. We've seen the covenant with Abraham. We actually, earlier than that, we saw a covenant through Noah, where God promised never to destroy the world by water again. This time, we are seeing the third major covenant of the Old Testament, and it is not with an individual, it's with a people. It's with a people. It's with a nation. And through this covenant, God is forwarding his story. God is stepping forward with his plan to save the world. Now, very briefly, let's talk about what a covenant is. A covenant is an ancient, it was sort of like a legal contract, but it wasn't quite as simple as a contract. In the ancient world, they needed a way to figure out a relationship between people who were not biologically related to each other. And so everything within the ancient world was framed in terms of a family. I know how to treat my brother. I don't know how to treat a stranger other than to kill him, right? I know how to treat my father, but I don't know how to treat, if you are not in my tribe, I have no way of dealing with you. And so what they created were covenants, which was a kind of contract that created a fictional kinship, created a fictional relationship where there actually was not one. And so there were contracts that said, you are not my brother, but I'm going to treat you as my brother, and we're going to cut this covenant together. We're going to sign this covenant together. There were covenants that said, you are not my father, but I'm going to treat you as though you were my father, and we are going to sign this covenant. They didn't sign things. The reason I use that term, cut a covenant, that was what they called it because there would be a sacrifice that took place in order to make the covenant legal. So they would cut the covenant together, and all of a sudden, these two tribes that were not blood relation with each other would behave as though they were. So the best analogy we have of this in our modern day is marriage. Marriage is two people who ideally are not blood relation to each other, right? In an ideal situation, not blood relation to each other, and yet they are doing something together that creates a relationship. Covenant is different than what we think of in contract because covenant fundamentally changes the identity of the people who enter into it. The same way when you get married, it is a different level of agreement or commitment than if you buy a car. If you engage in a covenant, it is a different level of agreement and commitment than if you sign a contract. And that what God is doing with his people here in Exodus is God is saying, what I want with you is a covenant. What I want with you is a covenant. And in fact, the legal form that this covenant takes is the legal form that was used between a lord and their vassal. So a very, very powerful tribe would sometimes cut a covenant with a less powerful tribe. And the very powerful tribe will say, I will offer you protection. And the less powerful tribe will say, I will offer you obedience. And the image was, I am the father and you are the son. We are not blood relation, but from now on, because we have this covenant, I will behave as though you are my son. You will behave as though you are my father. And so what God is doing here, what you see over and over again in this language of when God brings the people and he consecrates them, and he says, we are going to cut this covenant together. I am your God and you will be my people. This is a kind of a marriage, but not a marriage as we think of between two partners coming together. This is a kind of a marriage that creates what was for them a biological relationship between a father and a child. I will give you my protection. I will give you my sustenance. I will give you my covering. All the earth will know that you are mine, and what you will give me is your obedience and your love and your faithfulness, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. That is the covenant that God is setting up in this section of the book of Exodus. Now, I want to step back with you for a second. I just want to think about that concept. Because if you've been to church a lot, you've probably heard a lot about covenants, and you never stop to think, why did God do it this way? God could have done it a whole lot of ways. God could have asked for, I rescued you from slavery in Egypt, now you will be my slaves, right? God could have set up that paradigm, but he didn't. He used this one. And he used this image of covenant of I am your God and you are my people to describe what it meant to be the people of God. So what does that mean for us? Because I'll tell you what, fast forward down the road, you get another scene where Jesus is sitting at a table and he's holding a cup and he says, this is my blood of the new covenant poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. So not only did Jesus draw a connection between himself and the Passover lamb, he drew a connection between what God was about to do with the people of God and what God had done in Exodus. That God created a covenant with the people of God, and God was creating a new covenant through Jesus. Why? Okay, I've got a couple quick thoughts to share with you. Because I think if we fully understand what covenant means, it can go to the heart of a lot of the misunderstandings that you and I have about the Christian faith, or about faith in general. And the first one really narrows in on that. Covenant changes identity. Covenant is more about identity than it is about a contract. Covenant is about who you are, and who you are affects who you behave, but who you are is deeper than who you behave, than how you behave. So the best graduation sermon I ever heard, I actually forgot who, it was one of my classmates in seminary preached this. And he was standing in front of a bunch of seniors about to graduate, and the graduation sermon went about like this. There are things in your life, milestones, that change your identity. And the biggest mistake you can make is living as though those milestones never passed. Living as graduation is a milestone, and living as though you are a high school student when you're in fact a young adult. Marriage is a milestone, and living as though you are single when you are in fact married. Having kids is a milestone, and living as though you have no kids when you in fact have children. As you go throughout life, you pass these milestones that actually change who you are. And the biggest mistake you can make, the easiest way to tank your life, is to live as though those didn't pass and you are still the person you used to be. Because not all of them, but many of them involve some kind of a covenant, and a covenant changes who you are from the inside out. Christianity, the Christian faith, faith with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was never intended to be a hobby. It was never intended to be something that we did for fun. It was also never really intended to be a contract. So the misunderstandings I hear about the faith, one is it's something I like doing every now and then on Sunday morning. That's one level of misunderstanding. But the other misunderstanding is this. I know I'm going to go to heaven because I said the prayer 20 years ago. That sounds a whole lot more like buying a car than joining a family, right? I said the prayer, I signed the contract. The contract God and I have is that I go to heaven because I signed on the dotted line. That's describing a contract. What God has offered, both in Exodus and to the people of God today, is a covenant. It's something that gets into the very fabric of who you are. The same way when you get married, you start becoming a different person on the other side of that than you were before, because it gets into who you are. When you have children, you start behaving differently than you did before because it gets into the very nature of who you are. What God has done in Christ is invite all of humanity into the family of God. Invite all humanity into a new covenant, a new family, a new body. And that change is something that does affect our time, but it affects a whole lot more than that. It gets into the very depth of who we are, how we live in the world, how we see ourselves, and yes, how we steward resources like time and money and all of those other things. It affects everything. And so if the image that we have of what we're doing in faith is less than it's something that affects everything, then there's a danger that we're not living in the right story, right? We're not actually living in the story presented by the God of Exodus and the God of the New Testament. There's a danger that we're living in this misunderstanding whereby we are substituting contract for covenant. So that's the first thing I see. Covenant changes who you are. The second thing about covenants is that covenants require some level of sacrifice, not only by both parties, but covenants actually, the way that they became legal was that they made a sacrifice. And I think that was intentional. In the ancient world, worship centered around sacrifice because they wanted to show everyone how serious this was. You and I take food for granted. You and I take the abundance of food that is around us for granted. If you and I were in the ancient world and starvation was always one season away, it would mean something different if there were food offered on an altar, right? It would mean that we're taking this very seriously. This is a very serious thing happening right now. And so when the ancient priests would cut a covenant, they would sacrifice an animal. And then they would actually sprinkle the blood of the animal on the gathered congregation, sometimes with the words, "the blood of the sacrifice that has been shed for you." Does that sound at all familiar? Jesus used this language later when he was sitting at the Last Supper, but where he got it from was this idea that the making of the covenant required a sacrifice. So when Jesus then sat at the Last Supper, and he said, "This is my blood shed for you," what he was saying is God already did it. God already did it. God already made the sacrifice that is necessary for this new covenant to be established and to be opened to all of you. And the invitation is there so that, and this is very important, so that whatever sacrifice you might feel coming into this covenant will be eternally less than the sacrifice God made for you to open it. Right? We all know that when you enter into a covenant of any kind, you make sacrifices. If you enter into a marriage covenant, you are sacrificing your life as a single person. You might be doing it gladly, but you are still sacrificing your life as a single person. If you enter into a covenant having children, you are sacrificing your sleep for the next 6 years, at least. You are sacrificing your right to have a clean house without food all over the floor. You are sacrificing things in order to enter into this new covenant. And you know what? Entering into the family of God is no less. When you become a new person, it means you turn away from some things. It means you turn aside from some things in order to embrace other things. And so, yes, you are sitting in church rather than having brunch on a Sunday morning. But you know what? That's the tip of the iceberg. That's the tip of the iceberg. It means as you go through life, you will find the Holy Spirit within you continually nudging you away from certain practices and toward certain practices. And I'll tell you what, if you go at all far in the Christian life, you will feel that you are having to sacrifice, right? Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me." And you will feel at some point you're going to be giving up something. You're going to be giving up something. People have given up jobs. People have given up opportunities. People have given up all kinds of things because they felt the Holy Spirit was leading them to. The point that Exodus is making for us with the concept of covenant is that you will never give up more than God already gave up for you. Never. The most that you could possibly be asked to give up in this life is your life. I pray that none of us are ever asked to make that level of sacrifice, but even if we are in the company of God who already gave up his life for us. When we come into this covenant, we come by the means of the blood of Christ, which means God's sacrifice is already greater than any he will ever ask of us. In the privileges he is offering us in the covenant, that of being a beloved child of God, rather than enslaved by the old creation, is so great that that sacrifice will, in the view of eternity, seem little. So, covenants change who you are. Covenants are marked by sacrifice. You know, the only other thing I was thinking as I was looking at why God would have chosen covenant as an image for how the family of God is formed, for how the family of God lives. It's because when you think about it, covenants, people keeping covenants are really the way the world turns. People keeping covenants are the way God achieves things in this world. I want you to imagine the world we would live in if nobody kept promises ever. I want you to imagine the world we would live in if there was no such thing as a commitment, if there was no such thing as a covenant, if people could, with the whims of their feelings, change on a fly so that I could have a kid one day and the next day decide I don't want the kid, and the next day decide I do want the kid. What would that world look like? I mean, it would look pretty close to hell, if not Egypt, right? Because the goodness of God comes through the keeping of covenants. And that's something that first and foremost affects our covenant with God, our commitment with God, our membership in the family of God, but it extends out to all the other little covenants in our life, right? It extends out to all the other little commitments that we make, which is why when we come to the New Testament, and Paul is writing about the fruit of the Spirit and what it looks like for a person to be mature in the Holy Spirit and filled with love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness, the next one in that list is faithfulness. And the next one is self-control. Faithfulness and self-control as a marker of maturity in Jesus Christ, because God works through the fulfillment of covenants. God works through people keeping promises. God works through people just keeping on showing up and showing up and showing up, whether or not they feel like it. And I want to tell you that it's sometimes hard, that is sometimes boring, that sometimes feels like a sacrifice, that sometimes feels like we are not living the life that we want to live, and yet, every time we start going that way, we are pulled back to this image of Jesus sacrificing everything so that you and I could come in to this family. And you and I coming into this family of God is not only the greatest blessing we will ever receive, it is the means by which God is blessing the world. It's the means by which God is blessing the world. There was a story a young woman told me once about she'd grown up in a really rough household. And she snuck away one Sunday and started going to church. You want to know how your house is bad? Is when your rebellion is going to the church down the street, when you're old enough to go. And so she snuck away and she started going to church. And she said she showed up every single Sunday, and every single Sunday those people were there. And there was no massive intervention. I mean, this was before the days of CPS, really, so there was no massive intervention. There was no big thing, but they showed up for her every week. And she said, I don't know how, but somehow the relationships that I made there gave me the spiritual foundation to leave my home when I got old enough and to start living a life unlike the ones I had seen in my house. And it was all just because these people kept showing up for me, week after week after week after week. Friends, I'd like to suggest to you this morning that many of the miracles that God does in our lives are small, are unnoticeable because they are growing little by little, week by week. They are not huge, they are not grand, they are not things that make the headlines, but they are no less miracles because God is doing them through the faithfulness of his family and through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And so as you and I, as members of the family of God, consider what it means to live our lives well, this is the example that is given to us. Behold, the blood of the new covenant, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins, so that we might all become a part of the family of God. Would you join with me in a word of prayer?